Marjorie stood frozen in the nursery, the metallic scent of old silver stinging her nostrils as she pulled the flannel blanket back from her infant son's crib. Instead of a soft mattress, her hand brushed against the jagged, upright needles of a dozen antique brooches hidden beneath the fabric, arranged in a rigid, ritualistic pattern around the sleeping child. Before she could scream, a hand clamped onto her wrist with the crushing force of a steel vise. She looked up into the eyes of the woman she had hired to protect her home, but saw only a cold, predatory blankness that didn't belong to a stranger. The house, once a sanctuary of polished oak and morning sunlight, suddenly felt like a throat closing shut. Downstairs, the muffled sound of her husband's laughter drifted up, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the bruises blooming like dark ink across Marjorie's skin. As she struggled to pull away, she noticed the tiny crimson glow of a hidden camera lens pulsing in the corner of the ceiling, recording her terror for an audience she hadn't invited. The locks on the nursery door clicked shut from the outside, and for the first time in her life, the successful doctor realized she wasn't the mother in this house anymore. She was the specimen. A single beam of morning sun sliced through the heavy velvet drapes of the kitchen in Weston, Illinois, carving a path of light through the lingering shadows. It illuminated tiny motes of dust dancing over the expansive oak table, a surface polished to such a high gloss that it mirrored the white ceiling. Marjorie Keller stood by the counter, her lungs filling with the rich, earthy scent of freshly ground Arabica beans, while the espresso machine emitted a rhythmic, comforting hiss. Her fingertips traced the cool, smooth glaze of her favorite ceramic mug, a hand-thrown piece with a weight that grounded her. From the adjacent living room, the muffled, bubbling laughter of little Leo drifted in, punctuated by the crisp, rhythmic snapping of the Sunday Tribune as David Keller turned the pages. Marjorie watched a sliver of golden butter yield to the heat of a thick slice of sourdough, melting into a translucent, glistening trail across the toasted surface. The plush pile of the Persian rug tickled her bare arches, a soft contrast to the clinical hardness of the hospital floors she navigated during the week. She allowed her eyelids to flutter shut for a moment, absorbing the symphony of a house awakening. The distant, liquid song of a robin perched in the oak tree outside and the steady hum of the refrigerator. The heavy, quilted warmth of her silk robe draped over her shoulders like a protective cocoon, sealing her in a fleeting pocket of domestic serenity. The tranquility shattered when the sharp steel of a letter opener crunched through the thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed seal of Chicago Central Hospital. Marjorie stood in the foyer, the air suddenly turning thin as she pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. The words "internal investigation" and "anonymous complaints" stared back at her in a rigid, sans serif font that felt like a physical blow. Blood drained from her face, leaving her extremities numb and tingling with a sudden, icy chill. The text surged with accusations of professional misconduct and ethical breaches. Claims so surreal they bordered on a fever dream. Her eyes darted across the paragraphs, snagging on the names of colleagues she had mentored, their faces now blurring into a kaleidoscopic mess of betrayal. The pungent, chemical odor of fresh printer ink mingled with a metallic tang of fear that coated her tongue. The paper chattered in her grip, the sound mimicking the dry, frantic rustle of dead leaves underfoot in a winter wind. A sharp, mechanical shriek of a power drill tore through the silence of the living room, causing Marjorie to jump. Grace, the new nanny installed by Evelyn, stood atop a stepladder in the corner of the ceiling, her movements efficient and devoid of warmth. She was driving a mounting bracket into the plaster, her eyes fixed on the task with a singular focus. The glossy obsidian eye of a wide-angle camera lens now peered down from the heights, its gaze fixed directly on the dining table where Marjorie sat paralyzed. Grace hopped down with the fluid, predatory grace of a cat and, without looking back, explained that Evelyn had personally mandated this enhanced surveillance for the infant's safety. Marjorie's gaze shifted to the kitchen wall, where a tiny crimson LED on a second camera flickered to life, recording every blink of her eyes. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with static and the sticky, claustrophobic sensation of being watched by a hidden observer. Grace wiped her hands on a lemon-scented wet wipe, casting a brief, needle-sharp look of triumph toward Marjorie. Marjorie leaned over the white slats of the crib to smooth Leo's flannel blanket, but she recoiled instantly as a sharp, stinging pain lanced through her palm. Tucked among the soft folds of the fabric were several antique silver brooches, their long, wicked needles thrust into the mattress in the unmistakable shape of a crucifix. Her breath hitched as she spotted heavy silver rosary beads coiled tightly around the dark wood of the crib's legs, the links glinting with a dull, tarnished light in the nursery's gloom. The cold, unyielding metal of these objects felt like an invasion, a dangerous presence mere inches from Leo's soft, vulnerable skin. Grace stood framed in the doorway, her shadow stretching across the floor as she watched Marjorie inspect these charms. The heavy, cloying scent of frankincense and aged silver filled Marjorie's nostrils, triggering a wave of nausea. Below the metallic clutter, she could hear Leo's rhythmic, innocent breathing, the child entirely unaware of the jagged edges surrounding his small body. Impulse took over as Marjorie snatched the piercing brooches from the bedding, her knuckles white with the intent to hurl them into the trash. Before she could take a step, Grace moved with startling speed, her hand clamping onto Marjorie's wrist like a pressurized steel vise. A gasp of shock escaped Marjorie's throat as she felt the raw, disproportionate strength in the nanny's fingers. She watched Grace's knuckles turn a skeletal white from the force of the grip. The nanny's eyes, cold as slate, bored into Marjorie's face, showing no flicker of empathy, only a frozen, crystalline resolve. Marjorie twisted, trying to wrench her arm free, but the pressure only intensified, grinding the delicate bones of her wrist together. The throbbing pain forced her fingers to splay open, and the antique needles clattered onto the hardwood floor with a series of sharp, metallic pings. Grace slowly withdrew her hand, leaving behind a constellation of dark, angry bruises on Marjorie's pale skin. That evening, Marjorie stood in the glow of the bedside lamp, holding up her arm to show David the darkening marks on her wrist, her voice trembling as she begged for him to intervene. David didn't even lift his chin from the blue light of his tablet, his features a mask of weary, practiced indifference. He began to speak in a flat, metronomic tone, reciting a list of symptoms associated with severe postpartum depression. He suggested, with a chilling lack of emotion, that Marjorie had inflicted these injuries upon herself in a fit of hysteria and was now projecting the blame onto Grace. Marjorie felt a hollow, sickening sensation in her chest as she listened to this calculated lie. David reached out and gently, but with a firm finality, pushed her arm away, as if the sight of her skin were something repulsive. The room began to tilt and spin, the edges of her vision fraying while David's voice dissolved into an indistinguishable, low-frequency hum. Safe in the knowledge that David was occupied in the shower, Marjorie slipped into his home office, the scent of expensive leather and cedarwood clinging to the air. She began to sift through the stacks of correspondence on his desk, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Hidden beneath a pile of corporate tax returns, she pulled out a glossy, high-end brochure with gold foil lettering that read, "The Holy Spring." The cover depicted a grim, Gothic manor house encased by an iron fence and deep woods. Her blood ran cold when she recognized Evelyn's sharp, aggressive handwriting in the margins, circling a paragraph regarding involuntary isolation for the healing of the soul. The thumping in her ears grew deafening as she saw a specific date in the brochure's calendar marked with a thick, red, permanent marker. The heavy aroma of David's cologne suddenly felt like a physical weight, pressing the air out of her lungs. The heavy front door swung open with a thud, and Evelyn swept into the house, her spine as straight as a rod, and her white kidskin gloves still buttoned at the wrists. Marjorie watched from the hallway as her mother-in-law marched into the nursery and began to systematically fold Leo's tiny cotton rompers into a structured leather suitcase. David stood in the doorway, with his arms folded across his chest, his silence a tacit endorsement of his mother's invasion. Marjorie lunged for the crib, trying to shield her son with her own body. But Evelyn moved her aside with a single, practiced flick of her arm. Tears blurred Marjorie's sight as she watched Leo's favorite wooden rattle disappear into the dark maw of the luggage. Evelyn worked with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency, completely ignoring the ragged, choked sobs that escaped Marjorie's throat. A ringing silence descended on the room, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicks of the suitcase locks. Desperation drove Marjorie to the kitchen, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the receiver of the landline as she tried to dial her attorney's private number. Instead of a dial tone, the earpiece emitted only a flat, dead hiss of static. She sprinted to the laptop on the counter, but the screen flashed a cold, white box stating that the network connection had been severed. Grace stood in the archway of the hall, idly twirling a bundle of snipped copper wires between her fingers, a thin, icy smile stretching across her face. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic crashed over Marjorie, making the very walls of the house seem to tilt inward. She fumbled with her smartphone, pressing the power button repeatedly, only to see the words, "No signal," hovering over a blank bar. Grace began to walk toward her, a slow, deliberate advance that blocked the only path to the back exit. Marjorie turned toward the front hall, grabbing for her handbag. But David stepped into her path, his large frame filling the doorway. He reached out and, with a slow, agonizing deliberation, slid the car keys from her limp fingers. His face was a choreographed mask of pity, as he explained that driving in her current agitated state would be a liability to the public. The sound of clashing metal echoed in the foyer as he dropped the keys into the deep pocket of his wool blazer. A paralyzing sense of helplessness rooted Marjorie to the spot, forcing her to lean her weight against the cold, painted wainscoting. David took a step forward, looming over her until she was trapped in the shadow of his coat. She inhaled the scent of damp pavement and rain clinging to his shoulders, realizing with a jolt of terror that her isolation from the world was now absolute. Later, Marjorie crouched in the shadows behind a heavy velvet portiere in the library, her breath held tight in her chest. Evelyn entered the room, the heels of her pumps clicking sharply on the hardwood as she pressed a phone to her ear. Through a narrow slit in the fabric, Marjorie could see the tension in her mother-in-law's back and the way her fingers tapped a nervous, staccato beat on the desk. Evelyn spoke with a chilling clarity, confirming a time for the following morning, exactly 9 o'clock. The phrases medical transport and full custodial transfer fell from Evelyn's lips with the weight of a judge's gavel. A cold sweat broke out across Marjorie's brow as the full architecture of the conspiracy revealed itself. Evelyn hung up and paused to adjust her silver hair in the mirror, while Marjorie remained frozen, terrified that even the sound of her heartbeat might betray her hiding spot. The door to Marjorie's bedroom creaked open, and Grace entered carrying a tray with a bowl of lukewarm stew and a tall glass of water. Under Marjorie's watchful, suspicious gaze, Grace reached into her apron and produced a small, amber glass bottle with a dropper. With a steady hand, she squeezed several viscous, clear drops into the water, the liquid swirling like oil before disappearing into the clarity of the glass. Grace set the tray down on the nightstand with a soft thud and looked Marjorie directly in the eyes. She spoke in a low, soothing tone that didn't match the predatory gleam in her expression. urging Marjorie to drink so she could finally rest. The scent of the heavy, beef-based stew filled the air. But Marjorie could only focus on the glass of water, which now looked like a vessel of liquid lead. Grace stood over her, waiting, her presence a silent command that Marjorie could not yet find the strength to defy. The next morning, Marjorie's hand searched the floral wallpaper of the master suite until her fingers found the jagged, uneven seam in the dry wall. The hidden door of the wall safe, which usually sat flush behind a pastoral landscape painting, was hanging crookedly from a single, tortured hinge. The metal was scarred, the bolts having been wrenched from the studs with brutal force, leaving the interior smelling of scorched steel and industrial lubricant. She reached into the dark cavity, her hand closing on a leather-bound folder that felt mockingly light in her grasp. Where Leo's blue passport should have been, the one containing his first chubby-cheeked photo, there was only a fine layer of gray dust and a hollow void. Marjorie clutched the empty folder to her chest, the residual chill of the looted safe seeping through her silk blouse and into her skin. Driven by a cold, sharp clarity, Marjorie crossed to David's study and yanked the bottom drawer of his oak desk so hard it groaned against the tracks. She began to tear through the organized stacks of legal documents until she found a thick sheaf of bank statements held together by a heavy brass clip. Red ink bled across the margins of the pages, documenting monthly transfers to Grace's private account that were triple the amount of her reported salary. At the bottom of the stack, Marjorie's eyes landed on photocopied medical forms bearing a clumsy forgery of her own psychiatrist's signature, accompanied by Grace's detailed observations of Marjorie's supposed hallucinations. The paper felt oily under her fingertips, a physical manifestation of the betrayal. She heard the distinct, rhythmic creak of a floorboard in the hall and instinctively balled the evidence into a tight, crumpled mass in her fist. The sharp, metallic click of the office door's lock echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. Evelyn stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She paused to peel off a single white glove, laying it across the polished desk like a duelist's challenge, before sliding a slim, high-definition tablet toward Marjorie. On the glowing screen, Marjorie saw a digitized document bearing a state seal and the bold, terrifying heading of a parental rights termination order. The harsh blue light of the display accentuated the deep, triumphant lines around Evelyn's mouth. Marjorie reached out to touch the screen, but Evelyn snatched the device back with a predatory hiss, leaving Marjorie with only the lingering image of her name typed next to the word unfit. The air in the study grew thick and stagnant, heavy with the scent of Evelyn's vintage face powder. Evelyn closed the distance between them, the scent of her lavender perfume becoming a suffocating cloud. She leaned in until her lips were inches from Marjorie's ear, her voice a low, melodic poison as she spoke of the evening's upcoming gala. She detailed the necessity of Marjorie maintaining an impeccable, smiling facade for the benefit of their high society guests. If Marjorie allowed a single crack in the mask, a stray tear, or a desperate plea, Evelyn promised that 2 orderlies were already stationed in a van at the end of the driveway. Marjorie's gaze flickered to the doorway, where she caught the cold, stainless steel glint of handcuffs dangling from Grace's hand. The weight of the ultimatum settled onto Marjorie's shoulders, forcing her to stiffen her spine. Her mouth felt like it was filled with ash, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird hitting the bars of a cage. The grand staircase felt like a descent into a lion's den as Marjorie stepped down, the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes pressing against her. The foyer was filled with men in charcoal suits and women in shimmering silks, their conversations dying a sudden, awkward death as she appeared. David stepped forward, his hand clamping onto Marjorie's elbow with a force that made the small bones of her arm grind together. He wore a practiced, charming smile as he introduced her to a circle of donors. but his fingers dug into her triceps so hard she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The crystalline chime of toasting glasses and the low hum of curated gossip felt like the ambient noise of a coordinated execution. Every movement David made was a subtle, forceful steer, guiding her through the room like a prisoner in a parade. Grace, dressed in a crisp, blindingly white nurse's uniform, glided into the center of the drawing room while cradling a sleeping Leo against her shoulder. Evelyn stepped beside her, placing a possessive hand on the nanny's arm to draw the attention of the entire assembly. Marjorie watched, paralyzed, as her mother-in-law addressed the room, praising Grace as the sole pillar of stability and the guardian angel of the household during Marjorie's unfortunate period of mental fragility. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the guests, their eyes turning toward Marjorie with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Leo shifted in his sleep, his small hand curling, and Marjorie took an instinctive step toward him. But David's grip on her arm became an agonizing, bone-deep pressure. Grace cast a brief, searing look of victory over the child's head, her lips curling into a faint, cruel smile. Through a gap in the forest of silk-clad legs, Marjorie spotted a subtle movement beneath the long, lace-trimmed buffet table. Grace, while appearing to smooth the heavy fabric, used her foot to nudge a large, structured leather bag deeper into the shadows near Evelyn's feet. Marjorie recognized the distinctive brass buckle on the side. It was the bag packed with Leo's winter coats and his favorite thick flannel blanket. Evelyn gave a microscopic nod to the nanny, subtly shifting the hem of her long evening coat to obscure the luggage from the guests' view. The rich, savory aroma of roasted tenderloin and aged Bordeaux swirled in Marjorie's head, clashing with the sharp, cold realization that a kidnapping was being staged in plain sight. She watched as Grace performed a quick, surreptitious check of the bag's zipper before returning to her pose of stoic devotion. Evelyn picked up a silver dessert spoon and tapped it against the rim of a crystal flute, the sharp ringing sound instantly silencing the room. She raised her glass, the champagne bubbles dancing in the light, and her voice took on a tone of practiced, tragic solemnity as she announced Marjorie's voluntary leave of absence for psychiatric treatment. Marjorie felt a cold, oily sweat crawl down her spine as Evelyn lectured the guests on the fragility of the maternal mind and the sacred duty of the Keller family to protect their heir. David nodded in a slow, rhythmic cadence with his mother's words, his face as unreadable as a tombstone. Marjorie watched the guests lift their glasses in a synchronized motion, a silent toast to her own erasure. The golden liquid in Evelyn's glass seemed to shimmer with a deceptive, predatory light. Marjorie's breath hitched as she saw Evelyn lean over the sleeping child, her hand stroking Leo's cheek with a chilling, possessive tenderness. The guests began to move toward the dining room, their voices rising in a renewed tide of polite chatter, leaving Marjorie standing at the edge of the circle. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the house's history and Evelyn's malice pressing in on her from all sides. Her eyes locked on the leather bag hidden under the table, then shifted to the exit. The realization that this was the final moment, the tipping point before the medical van moved in, sent a jolt of raw, electric adrenaline through her veins. She stood perfectly still, her mind racing through the geography of the house, while the sound of the grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the last seconds of her old life. In a sudden, violent motion, Marjorie wrenched her shoulder upward, snapping her arm out of David's skeletal grip. The sound of the silk seams in her gown tearing was a sharp, satisfying crack in the quiet room. She plunged her hand into the tight, restrictive fabric of her bodice, her fingers closing on the crumpled bundle of bank statements and emails she had hidden against her skin. She whipped the papers out, the white sheets fanning out like a deck of cards in the light of the chandelier. David lunged toward her, his face contorting as he reached for the evidence. But Marjorie pivoted away, holding the documents high like a jagged shield. The sharp paper edges sliced into the pad of her thumb, leaving a thin, bright line of crimson that began to bead on the white page. Her voice tore through the heavy, stagnant air of the ballroom, rising above Evelyn's attempted interruptions with a clinical, piercing authority. She began to recite the data with a rhythmic, hammering precision. The dates of the transfers, the exact dollar amounts, and the offshore account numbers Evelyn had used to bankroll Grace's loyalty. She watched a frantic twitch develop in Evelyn's left eyelid, while dark, mottled flushes of rage climbed the older woman's throat. With every mention of the bribes paid for the forged psychiatric evaluations, the socialites in the room took a physical step back, creating a widening circle of isolation around Evelyn. Marjorie felt a dry, burning sensation in her throat. But her voice never wavered as she watched Grace shrink against the wall, her face turning the color of wet ash. Marjorie's hand shot out, thrusting a series of high-gloss photographs toward the nearest guests. The images clearly showed the long, wicked steel needles of the brooches piercing through the center of Leo's mattress. She held up the shots of the heavy, tarnished rosaries that had been used to bind the crib, her finger pointing directly at Evelyn's chest as she accused her of endangering the child to secure his trust fund. A sharp, collective intake of breath hissed through the room, followed by the crystalline smash of a dropped glass that punctuated her final sentence. Evelyn's face collapsed into a gray, sagging mask of ruin. Marjorie's description of the cold-blooded plan to institutionalize her and seize the child hung in the air like a poisonous fog, turning the guests' expressions from curiosity to horror. As Evelyn dissolved into a high-pitched, incoherent screech of denial, and the guests began to murmur in a rising tide of scandal, Marjorie spotted a familiar glint. She moved with the calculated stealth of a predator, her hand sliding into the deep pocket of David's blazer while he was embroiled in a heated, low-voiced argument with a family attorney. Her fingers closed around a heavy, cold leather fob embossed with the logo of their SUV. David felt the shift in his coat and turned, his eyes widening. But Marjorie had already skipped backward, her fist clenched around the keys so tightly the metal teeth bit into her palm. The icy sensation of the steel gave her a sudden, grounding surge of power. She saw Grace push off the wall, preparing to move, and Marjorie knew her window of opportunity was closing in heartbeats. She launched herself forward in a blurring, horizontal streak, closing the gap between herself and Grace before the nanny could even draw a breath. Without a word, Marjorie slid her arms beneath Leo's warm, limp weight, scooping him from Grace's grasp in one fluid motion. She felt the rhythmic, soft puff of his breath against the skin of her neck and the familiar, comforting scent of lavender and baby powder. Grace's hands clutched at the empty air, her mouth falling open in a silent "oh" of shock. Marjorie spun on her heel, using her own back as a barrier to shield the child from the reaching fingers of her mother-in-law. Her heart hammered a frantic duet against Leo's chest, a single pulse of survival and hope. She adjusted her grip on the sleeping boy, her muscles coiling for the dash toward the service corridor. Grace crouched, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to spring at Marjorie. But the doctor was already a step ahead. Marjorie swung her foot out, the toe of her designer pump catching the leg of a heavy, wheeled mahogany serving cart. With a deafening, discordant crash, dozens of crystal flutes and silver platters slid off the marble top, shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds across the parquet floor. Grace shrieked as the shards bit into the thin soles of her uniform shoes, and even Evelyn recoiled from the sparkling, dangerous carpet of debris. The pungent, yeasty scent of spilled brut champagne filled the air as Marjorie leapt over the widening puddles of glass and alcohol. She heard David's guttural roar of fury echoing from the foyer. But she didn't slow down, her eyes fixed solely on the swinging doors of the kitchen. Marjorie burst through the swinging doors, her breath coming in ragged, burning gulps as she sprinted through the white-tiled kitchen and into the darkened garage. The sharp, biting chill of the night air hit her lungs like a tonic. She fumbled with the key fob, the locks of the SUV clicking open with a heavy, mechanical thud, and she slid into the driver's seat, gently settling Leo into his padded car seat. She slammed the door and hit the electronic locks just as David's silhouette appeared in the doorway of the house. She watched his face, distorted by the overhead garage lights, into something unrecognizable and monstrous. As he hammered his fist against the reinforced glass of the window, Marjorie slammed the car into reverse, the tires screaming against the concrete and leaving a thick, acrid cloud of burnt rubber as she tore down the driveway and into the night. The amber glow of the Weston estate's gate lights faded into a pair of tiny, receding sparks in the rearview mirror. Marjorie's hands were a death grip on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, the vibration of the high-performance engine humming through her forearms and into her teeth. The vehicle devoured the dark miles of the highway, carving a path toward the older, brick-lined arteries of the city. She took a sharp, screeching turn into a narrow cobblestone alleyway that smelled of damp brick and ancient coal soot. In the shadow of a crumbling, ivy-covered brownstone sat the apartment she had purchased a decade ago, a secret she had guarded like a weapon. She killed the ignition and sat in the sudden, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic tink-tink of the cooling engine. Beside her, Leo remained in a deep, undisturbed sleep. Inside the dim, dust-moted apartment, Marjorie navigated by the flickering, neon-blue light of a distant street lamp. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and, with a sharp, final snap, broke the SIM card in half before dropping it into the drain. She knelt on the hardwood floor and pried up a loose board, retrieving a slim laptop encased in a protective layer of anti-static plastic. Her fingers flew across the keys with a frantic, precise energy, bypassing security protocols to enter an encrypted messaging suite. A chat window bloomed on the screen, connecting her to a high-stakes litigation attorney in Seattle, whose name Evelyn Keller had never heard. She felt the violent tremors in her hands begin to subside as a line of text appeared on the screen. A confirmation of aid. The dry, stagnant scent of the air in the room felt like the first clean breath she had taken in years. The following morning, a pale, lemon-colored sun spilled across the scarred wooden table of a quiet diner as Marjorie slid a heavy accordion file toward a man in a rumpled suit. The detective from the anti-corruption unit adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes scanning the original bank receipts of Evelyn's transfers with a grim intensity. Marjorie watched his expression over the rim of a heavy mug, the bitter, black coffee scalding her throat as she swallowed. He let out a low whistle when he reached the pages detailing the forged medical signatures, his pen scratching a series of rapid, decisive notes into a leather-bound ledger. The roar of the morning traffic outside seemed to lose its edge, the weight that had crushed her chest for months finally beginning to fracture. The detective snapped his briefcase shut, and Marjorie knew the slow, grinding gears of the law were finally turning toward the Keller mansion. Marjorie stood with her forehead pressed against the cool, vibrating glass of the diner's front window, watching the police headquarters across the street. A black, unmarked sedan pulled up to the curb, and two uniformed officers emerged, flanking Evelyn Keller. The older woman looked diminished, her spine finely curved as she was led toward the precinct doors. Directly behind her was Grace, her head bowed and her face obscured by the hood of a dark jacket. Marjorie's gaze shifted to the stone steps, where David stood alone, a cell phone pressed to his ear in a gesture of frantic, useless pleading. He looked around the plaza, his movements jerky and desperate. But the morning commuters merely flowed around him like water around a stone. Marjorie took a long, deep breath, feeling the icy knot of terror in her stomach finally dissolve under the strengthening warmth of the spring sun. The heavy nib of the fountain pen scratched across the thick parchment of the final decree, leaving a trail of dark, permanent ink. Marjorie watched the liquid dry on her signature, a mark that finalized her absolute and sole custody of Leo. Her attorney gathered the documents with a professional, satisfied nod, sliding them into a briefcase. Marjorie stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked toward the window of the law office. Below, the city was a vibrant, chaotic hum of life and possibility. She felt the weight of the pen in her hand, a small thing that had nonetheless rewritten her entire world. She turned away from the desk, her stride long and certain, and stepped out of the office to find Leo waiting for her in the hall. The end.